sister Lena grew New Zealand spinach along the south edge of her garden plot, and I've never met another person who did this. I mention it first because it's the detail that will matter most by the end, but also because I need you to understand how specific a choice it is. New Zealand spinach, Tetragonia tetragonioides, is not spinach. It's not related to spinach. It's a sprawling, fleshy-leaved ground cover from the southern hemisphere that tolerates heat and poor soil, and it tastes like spinach only if you pick it young and don't think too hard about the texture. Almost nobody grows it. It's not in seed catalogs. You have to order it from specialty suppliers or save seed from someone who already grows it. It is a plant that requires intention. Lena grew it because she was Lena, because she'd read about it in a 1970s homesteading book she'd found at a garage sale when she was 19, and because once Lena decided a thing was interesting, she committed to it with a thoroughness that I sometimes admired and sometimes found exhausting. She grew New Zealand spinach for 7 years, from the first season she had her community garden plot through the last. The last season was 2023. Lena died in September of that year. Ovarian cancer, she was 34. The disease was advanced when they found it, and more advanced by the time they finished finding all of it, and the interval between diagnosis and death was 5 months, during which she lost her hair, her appetite, her ability to climb the stairs to her apartment, and worst, she said, worse than all of it, her garden season. She spent most of August in the hospital and was not conscious for the first frost. I cleaned out her plot in October. I pulled the New Zealand spinach last because I didn't want to pull it at all. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I cleaned out the plot. Community garden plots in our city are assigned by the Parks Department on an annual basis. When a gardener doesn't renew, the plot goes back into the waiting list. Lena's plot, number 34, at the East Hill Community Garden on Prospect Avenue, was reassigned for the 2024 season to whoever was next on the list. This is not a dramatic or meaningful process. It is administrative. You don't renew, you lose the plot. There's always a waiting list. The soil doesn't know who you are. I didn't visit the East Hill Garden in 2024. I could not. I drove past it once in June and looked at the fence from the road and felt a sensation like pressing on a bruise to check whether it still hurts. It did. I kept driving. In April of 2025, I moved to a new apartment. The apartment was on Prospect Avenue, 4 blocks from the East Hill Garden. I did not choose it for this reason. I chose it because the rent was manageable and it allowed dogs, and I had adopted Lena's dog, a graceless, affectionate mutt named Boone, who required a building with lenient pet policies. But the proximity meant that my daily walk with Boone took me past the garden, and the garden was unavoidable, and on the 3rd morning of these walks, I stopped avoiding it. I want to describe what I saw carefully, because the careful version is the true version, and the true version is the one that matters. Plot 34 was being worked, and this was not surprising. It was April, early season, and whoever had the plot would be preparing their beds. What I saw was a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s, kneeling in the dirt with a hoe, wearing a wide-brimmed canvas hat and rubber boots. She was turning the soil in the same quadrant-by-quadrant pattern that Lena used, starting from the northeast corner and working in concentric rectangles toward the center. This is not a standard method. Most gardeners till in rows or work the whole plot at once. Lena's method was something she'd developed herself, based on a theory about not compacting the soil you'd already loosened by walking on it. She'd explained it to me once in more detail than I needed with a diagram. I noticed the pattern. I stood on the gravel path with Boone leaning against my legs, and I thought, it's coincidence. Probably a more common technique than I realize. Probably Lena wasn't the only person who'd ever thought of it. I walked home. I didn't think about it again that day. Over the next 2 weeks, I passed the garden most mornings. I did not always stop. When I did, I glanced, at plot 34, the way you glance at a place that used to belong to someone you loved. Quickly, protectively, not wanting to see too much. The woman was there often, usually early, usually alone. She worked quietly and with focus. I did not speak to her. In early May, the plot began to take shape, and this is when the texture of my attention changed. Lena's garden had a layout. Not a casual arrangement, but a deliberate design that she'd refined over 7 years, adjusting each season based on the previous year's results. She kept a garden journal, a thick, battered composition notebook with hand-drawn plot maps, planting dates, variety names, yield notes, and observations in her cramped lefty handwriting. I have the journal. It was in the box of things I took from her apartment after she died, along with her seed collection, her boots, and 3 shelves of homesteading books. I have not opened it. I say this because I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe is not something I'm reconstructing from hazy memory. I knew Lena's garden. I visited it almost every week for 7 years. I helped her plant, weed, water, harvest. I ate what it grew. I could draw her plot layout from memory the way you could draw the floor plan of a childhood home. Not because I memorized it, but because I lived alongside it. In the first week of May, the woman in plot 34 put in her tomatoes along the west edge, staked with the same 6-foot wooden stakes Lena used, spaced at the same interval, roughly 30 inches, which is tighter than most guides recommend, but which Lena swore by, claiming the crowding forced the plants upward and improved air circulation. The woman used the same variety, I could tell from the leaf shape and the label on the starter pots. Brandywine. Not a rare variety, but not the default either. The default is Better Boy or Early Girl, the varieties the garden centers stack in pyramids by the entrance. Brandywine is an heirloom. You have to look for it or grow it from seed. Lena grew Brandywine every year. Beside the tomatoes, the woman put in a row of basil, Genovese from the look of it, interplanted at every 3rd tomato. Yes, this is called companion planting. It's not uncommon. But the ratio, every 3rd tomato, not every other, not every one, was Lena's ratio. Lena's journal, which I had not opened, but which I could see in my mind because she'd shown me the relevant page multiple times, had a note from 2019 that read, "Every other basil is too much. Every 3rd is right. The tomatoes need room to be tomatoes." I stood on the path and I counted every 3rd tomato. I counted again. I want to tell you that I went home and opened the journal. I didn't. I went home and sat on the kitchen floor with Boone in my lap, and I breathed in a way that was not quite crying and not quite hyperventilating, but was somewhere in the territory between. It's coincidence, I told myself. Community gardeners learn from each other. Maybe this woman had talked to someone who'd seen Lena's plot. Maybe she'd read the same books. Maybe 30-inch spacing and every 3rd basil are more common than I think. And I'm seeing patterns. Because I want to see patterns, because grief is a pareidolia engine, because the bereaved see faces in everything. This is what I told myself in May. By July, I had stopped being able to tell myself anything. Let me walk you through what grew in plot 34 between May and July, and then you can decide if I'm seeing faces in clouds. The east edge, pole beans on a trellis made of bamboo stakes and twine, constructed in a specific A-frame configuration that Lena had adapted from a photograph in a book called The Self-Sufficient Gardener by John Seymour, published in 1978. I know this because the book is on the shelf I took from Lena's apartment. And I know this because Lena built the trellis the same way every year, and I helped her tie the cross braces twice. The woman's trellis was identical, not similar. The same angles, the same knot style on the twine, a clove hitch, which is not the knot most people tie. Most people just wrap and double knot. The same height, the same number of cross braces. The northeast corner, a dense planting of marigolds. Not as a border this is common, but as a block. A solid 3 by 3 foot block of French marigolds in the corner, serving no decorative purpose, positioned specifically to attract beneficial insects to the bean trellis nearby. This was Lena's theory. She called it her bug hotel. I'd never seen anyone else do it. The center of the plot, a small open area with no plantings, roughly 4 feet square, with a flat stone placed in the middle. Lena left this space every year. She called it the sitting spot. She'd put a stone there. She found a new one each season, always flat, always from the creek bed in East Hill Park. And she'd sit on it in the evenings when the light was long and drink tea from a thermos and watch the garden do what gardens do when no one is working in them. She told me once that the sitting spot was the most important part of the plot because it was the part that was for her, not for the vegetables. It was where the garden became a place instead of a project. The woman had a sitting spot, same location, same dimensions, a flat stone. I need to describe the day I saw the stone because the stone is when something changed in me that has not changed back. It was a Saturday morning in late June when I was on the path with Boone. The woman was in the plot, kneeling near the bean trellis, tying up a runner that had come loose. She had her back to me. I looked at the center of the plot and I saw the stone, and my vision did something. Not blurred, not darkened. Something more like shifted. The way your focus shifts when you realize the thing you've been looking at is not at the distance you thought it was. The stone was flat and gray-brown and roughly oval, and it was the kind of stone you find in the creek bed in East Hill Park. And it was sitting in a cleared 4-foot square in the center of plot 34, exactly where Lena's stone had sat for 7 years. And the woman turned around and looked at me. She did not look startled. She did not look curious. She looked at me the way you look at someone you've noticed before. A familiar passing face. A neighbor you haven't spoken to. She nodded. A small friendly nod. Then she went back to her tying. I did not nod back. I think I stood there for 10 or 15 seconds without moving, and then I walked home and I sat on the kitchen floor again. And this time Boone didn't come to me because Boone was standing at the door looking back toward the garden and whining, the way he whined when Lena was in the hospital, and he stood at the door of her apartment, waiting for her to come home. I opened the journal. I sat cross-legged on the floor, and I opened Lena's garden journal for the first time since her death. And I went through it page by page, season by season, and I compared what was written there to what I had seen growing in plot 34. It matched, not loosely, not in the general strokes. It matched the way a performance matches a score. The 2023 layout, Lena's final season, the one she'd planned in March and planned in April before the diagnosis in May, the one I'd finished cleaning out in October, was reproduced in plot 34 with a fidelity that I could not attribute to coincidence, influence, or shared horticultural philosophy. The same varieties, the same spacing, the same companion pairings, the same idiosyncratic structural choices, the same sitting spot with the same kind of stone. But here is the part that turned coincidence into something else. The part that I've not been able to explain away in the months since. Lena's 2023 layout was not the same as her 2022 layout, or her 2021, or any previous year. Every season she adjusted. She rotated crops to manage soil health. She tried new varieties. She moved the bean trellis from the east edge in 2022 to the north edge in 2023. She changed the marigold block from the northwest corner to the northeast. She increased the tomato spacing from 24 inches in her early years to 30 by 2023. Plot 34 was not reproducing a Lena garden. It was reproducing the 2023 Lena garden, the final iteration, the version that incorporated every lesson from every previous season, the version that Lena had spent 7 years arriving at and had only gotten to see for 4 months before her body made the garden unreachable. This woman was not gardening like Lena. She was gardening like Lena at the end, like the most refined, most complete version of Lena's practice, as though she had access not just to the final layout, but to the entire developmental history that produced it. I did not sleep well that week. I did not sleep well any week after. But I kept walking past the garden. I kept watching. And the garden kept growing, and every time I looked, it was more like Lena's, in ways that became increasingly specific, increasingly impossible to dismiss, and increasingly difficult for me to witness without feeling that something was happening to my understanding of what a person is and where a person goes when they die. In mid-July, the woman planted New Zealand spinach along the south edge. I knew before I saw it. I knew because the south edge had been left bare, while the rest of the plot filled in, and the bare strip was the right width, and the timing was right. Lena always direct seeded her New Zealand spinach in mid-July because it germinates best in warm soil. And I knew because by that point I had stopped being surprised and started being something else. Something I don't have a word for, something that lived in the space between grief and wonder and felt like neither. I watched the woman kneel in the south edge and open a seed packet and sow in a careful line, pressing each seed into the soil with her thumb. And I knew, not believed, not suspected, knew that the seeds were New Zealand spinach, because there was nothing else they could be, because the plot demanded it, because the pattern demanded it, because Lena's garden was completing itself in the hands of a stranger, and the only piece missing was the piece that had been most distinctly Lena's. I spoke to her for the first time that day. I don't remember deciding to. I remember being on the path with Boone and then being at the edge of the plot, and the woman looking up at me with soil on her knees and her hat shading her face, and my mouth was already open. I said, What are you planting? She said, I'm not sure of the name. Something I ordered from a seed catalog, a kind of spinach, I think, but not really spinach. She smiled. I don't know why I wanted to grow it. I just saw it in the catalog and something about it felt right. Do you garden? My sister did, I said. She had this plot. The woman's expression shifted, not dramatically, a softening. Oh, I'm sorry, the waitlist coordinator told me the previous gardener had passed away. I didn't know it was. I'm sorry. It's okay. Does it bother you? Seeing someone else in her plot? I didn't answer right away because the honest answer was complicated. It did not bother me. It should have. It should have been an intrusion, a violation, someone else's hands in Lena's soil. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like, and I'm going to say this as plainly as I can, and without dressing it up, it felt like watching Lena's garden continue without Lena, as though the garden had found a way to keep going by teaching itself to a person who didn't know she was being taught. "No," I said, "it doesn't bother me. I'm glad. I feel very at home here. More than I expected. I've never had a garden before." I heard the sentence, and I let it pass, and then it doubled back and hit me. "You've never gardened before?" "Never. I moved here last fall, from out of state. I don't know anyone. I signed up for the plot because I wanted a reason to be outside. Everything I'm doing, I'm figuring out as I go." She gestured at the plot. The brandywine tomatoes staked at 30 inches, the every third basil, the clove-hitched A-frame trellis, the marigold block, the sitting stone. I keep expecting to make a mess of it, but it's like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like my hands know what to do before I've thought about it. Like the soil already has an opinion. She laughed when she said it. A light, self-deprecating laugh. She did not think she was saying anything strange. She thought she was describing beginner's luck or instinct or the amusing experience of a new hobby clicking faster than expected. I looked at her hands. They were not Lena's hands. They were broader, older, differently shaped. But they were in Lena's soil, and they were doing Lena's work. And the woman behind them had never gardened before and was reproducing a 7-year practice from its most evolved form, and she didn't know. She didn't know. This is the part I have to be honest about, because this is where the story becomes about me and not about the garden. I could have told her. I could have said, "The garden you're building is an exact replica of my dead sister's garden, down to the variety choices and the knot type on the trellis. And you are doing this without any knowledge or experience, and I don't know what that means, but I think you should know it's happening." I didn't. And the reason I didn't is the reason I'm writing this, and the reason I can't stop watching, and the reason I lie awake at night with the journal open on my chest, following the plot maps with my finger, checking them against what I saw that day. I didn't tell her because I was afraid that if she knew, she'd stop. If she became self-conscious, if she started second-guessing her instincts, questioning why her hands reached for this seed and not that one, analyzing her own choices instead of following them, the pattern might break. The unconscious fidelity to Lena's design might dissolve into the noise of a beginner making deliberate decisions, instead of channeling whatever was flowing through her from the soil or the plot or the air or wherever it was coming from. And if the pattern broke, then Lena's garden would be over. Really over. Not just dormant, not just fallow, but over the way Lena was over. A thing that had existed and then didn't, with no continuation, no echo, no persistence. I could not do that. I could not be the reason it stopped. So I said nothing. I smiled. I said the garden looked beautiful. I introduced myself. Her name was Catherine. She asked if I wanted to sit in the garden sometime, and I said maybe. And she said there was a nice flat stone in the middle where she liked to sit in the evenings, and my throat closed and I nodded and walked away before she could see my face. I went home and I cried in a way I had not cried since the funeral. Not the wrenching, gasping grief of fresh loss, something older, deeper, more confused. I cried because my sister's garden was alive and my sister was dead, and the aliveness of the garden made the deadness of my sister more real, not less. I cried because a stranger named Catherine was sitting on a stone in the evening light drinking. I was certain of this without having seen it. Tea from a thermos, doing exactly what Lena did, for reasons she couldn't name, and the beauty of it was destroying me. I kept watching, through August, through September, while I walked Boone past the garden every morning, and I watched Catherine tend the plot, and I checked what I saw against the journal, and the journal was never wrong. every choice Catherine made matched. The late summer pruning of the tomato suckers, the timing of the bean harvest, the way she left the marigolds standing after they went to seed because Lena believed the dried heads attracted overwintering beneficial insects. In early September, Catherine did something that was not in the 2023 journal. She extended the New Zealand spinach planting around the corner from the south edge to the west edge. A short extension, maybe 4 additional feet. It broke the pattern. It was the first thing she'd done all season that didn't match Lena's final layout. I stood on the path and I stared at it and I want to be honest, I felt panic. A hot and irrational, possessive panic. That's wrong. Lena didn't do that. You're deviating, as though Catherine owed me the fidelity, as though the garden's purpose was to serve my grief and not its own growth. And then I went home and I opened the journal to the back pages, the pages after the 2023 plot maps, the pages I'd assumed were blank, and they weren't blank. Lena had written notes for 2024. She'd written them in March 2023 before the diagnosis. She always planned ahead. And in the 2024 plan, sketched in pencil on graph paper with her cramped left-handed writing, she had drawn the New Zealand spinach extending around the corner from the south edge to the west edge. A short extension, maybe 4 additional feet. Lena's handwriting said, NZ spinach wants more room. Try wrapping the corner next year and see if the west exposure affects flavor. Catherine was not reproducing the 2023 garden. Catherine had moved past the 2023 garden. Catherine was growing the garden Lena would have grown in 2024 if Lena had lived. The garden was not repeating. It was continuing. I need to stop here and tell you about the thing I did next, because it's the thing I'm least proud of and most confused by, and because it's the thing that brought me to where I am now. In late September, the growing season was ending. Frost was coming. Catherine would need to clean out the plot soon, and then winter would come, and the plot would be bare soil for 5 months. And in the spring, the question would be, does Catherine renew? Does she come back? Does the garden get a 3rd season, a 2026 season that Lena never planned, never sketched, never imagined? Yes, and if it does, what grows? I became obsessed with this question, not casually, not in the way you wonder about something interesting, obsessed in the way that interfered with my sleep, my work, my ability to be present in the rest of my life. Because the question was really, is Lena still here? And if she was still here, in the soil, in Catherine's hands, in whatever invisible conduit connected a dead woman's intentions to a living woman's instincts, then was she here finitely or infinitely? Was there a plan that would run out? Was Catherine a vessel that would eventually empty? Or was the garden genuinely growing forward, carrying Lena's horticultural mind into seasons she'd never see, making choices she'd never made, evolving in ways she would have evolved? And if it was the latter, if Lena's practice was somehow alive and developing inside Catherine, then what was Lena? What was Catherine? Where did one end and the other begin? I did the thing I'm least proud of. I went to the garden at night in early October after Catherine had done her fall cleanup. The plot was bare. The plants were gone, the stakes were pulled. The stone was still there. Catherine had left it, the way Lena always left it, as a marker, a promise that the gardener would return. I knelt in the dirt. I don't know why. I pressed my hands into the soil the way you'd press your hands against someone's chest to feel their heartbeat. The soil was cold and damp, and it smelled like October. Decomposition, mineral, the sweet must of spent plant matter. It smelled like every fall cleanup I'd done with Lena. And I took seeds from Lena's collection. The seeds I'd kept from her apartment, stored in labeled envelopes in a shoebox on my closet shelf. And I planted them. New Zealand spinach in the south edge, where Lena always put them, where Catherine had put them. I pressed them into the cold soil with my thumb, the same gesture I'd watched Catherine make in July, the same gesture Lena made every year. I was not planting a garden. It was October. Nothing would germinate. The seeds would sit in cold soil all winter and probably rot. But I was doing something. I was participating. I was adding myself to the circuit. Lena's intention, Catherine's hands, my grief, the soil. I was saying, I am here too. I am part of this. Whatever is flowing through this plot, let it flow through me. I stood up. I wiped my hands on my jeans, and I looked down at the plot in the dark, and I saw. This is the part where you will decide whether you believe me. I saw the plot differently. Not physically altered, not glowing, not changed, but differently the way you see a word differently once you know what it means. The bare soil was not empty. It was full. It was holding 7 years of Lena's choices and 1 year of Catherine's hands. And now my seeds and all the seasons that had not happened yet. And it was holding them the way soil holds, without effort, without intention, without knowing, just by being the kind of thing that holds. I went home. I slept through the night for the first time in months. In November, I saw Catherine at the grocery store. She recognized me, the woman from the path, the one with the dog. We talked. Small talk. Weather, the neighborhood. Boone, here, she said she was looking forward to the spring. She said she'd already been thinking about next year's garden. She said she had ideas. I said, what kind of ideas? She said, I want to try something new along the south edge. I've been growing a kind of spinach there, not real spinach, the New Zealand kind, and I love it. But I had this thought that I should try interplanting it with nasturtiums for color. And because, this sounds strange, because I had a dream about it, a dream about the garden with orange flowers along the south edge, mixed in with the green. It was so vivid, I woke up and I could smell the nasturtiums. She laughed. She thought it was a funny, charming anecdote about a new gardener getting carried away. I did not laugh. Because Lena grew nasturtiums, not in the garden plot, in window boxes on her apartment balcony, because she said they were too unruly for the structured plot. But she loved them. She talked about putting them in the garden someday. She said they'd look beautiful along the south edge, mixed in with the New Zealand spinach, orange against green, warm against cool. She never did it. She ran out of seasons. And now Catherine was dreaming about it. I went home and I opened the journal to the very last page, the page after the 2024 plans, the page I'd assumed was the end. And there, in pencil, so faint I hadn't seen it the first time I'd looked, was a single line in Lena's handwriting. Nasturtiums in the plot. Finally. 2025? A question mark. Possibility. A season she'd never live to reach. Written as a question to a future self who would never arrive. Except a future self had arrived. She just didn't know she was one. This is where I am now. This is what I carry. It is March. The ground is still frozen, but the seed catalogs have come, and I imagine Catherine is reading them, circling varieties, feeling the pull of choices she thinks are her own. In a few weeks, the soil will thaw, and she'll go to the plot and kneel in the dirt, and the garden will begin its next season. And the season will be a collaboration between a dead woman's aspirations and a living woman's hands, and neither of them will know the full shape of what they're making. And I will walk past with Boone every morning, and I will watch, and I will not tell Catherine who she is carrying, because I've decided, after months of agonizing, after nights of arguing with myself, after conversations with Lena that I conduct in my head and that I know are not real, but that feel more true than most real conversations I have, I have decided that telling her would be a violence. Not because the knowledge is dangerous, but because the knowledge would introduce choice, where right now there is only flow. Catherine's hands know what to do because they don't know they know. Her instincts are pure because they're not examined. She is Lena's garden in the way that a river is its source. Not by deciding to be, but by having no other direction available. If I tell her, she becomes a woman with a decision. Continue or stop, it's lean in or pull back, embrace the strangeness or reject it. And any decision she makes will be hers, not Lena's, and the channel will close, and the garden will become just a garden, and my sister will be dead in a way she is not dead right now. I know how this sounds. I know that a therapist, and I have one, and she is kind and competent, and I have not told her any of this, would say that I am constructing an elaborate grief architecture, that I am seeing pattern because I need pattern, that coincidence and confirmation bias and the universal commonalities of organic gardening can explain everything I've described without recourse to the supernatural. Maybe. But the therapist hasn't seen the journal. When the therapist hasn't stood on the path and watched a woman who has never gardened before tie a clove hitch on a bean trellis as though she'd done it 100 times. The therapist hasn't read a dead woman's penciled question. Nasturtiums in the plot. Finally, 2025? And then heard a stranger describe dreaming exactly that. And the therapist doesn't know about the thing I haven't told you yet. The last thing. 2 weeks ago, I was walking past the garden in the early morning. The plots were bare, snow-dusted, dormant. No one was there. Boone stopped at the edge of plot 34 and did what he always does. Pulled toward it, straining on the leash, whining softly. He's done this all year. I've assumed it's the smell of the soil, the residual scent of growing things. Some animal trace my nose can't detect. But this time he didn't just pull, and he sat right at the edge of the plot. And he looked at the center, at the sitting stone, which Catherine had left in place for the winter, and his tail moved. Not a full wag, a slow, low, tentative sweep. The sweep he used to make when Lena came home from work and he heard her key in the lock before the door opened. He was wagging at the stone, at the empty plot, at the frozen soil in the thin March light. And I heard, or felt, or remembered, or imagined. I no longer have the ability to distinguish between these. I heard my sister's voice, not words, not a message, just the quality of her, the frequency, the particular warmth of her attention, the way a room felt different when Lena was paying attention to you, the way her focus had a texture you could almost lean against. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then Boone stood up and shook himself and looked at me, and we walked home. I haven't been back since. Not because I'm afraid. Because the season is about to start and Catherine will be there soon, kneeling in the dirt, and the garden will begin again. And I need to be ready to watch it without interfering. I need to be ready to let Lena grow. I have the journal. I've read every page now, including the faintest pencil marks, including the margins, including the small drawings Lena made of leaf shapes and root structures, and the occasional face of Boone rendered in 3 quick lines. On the inside back cover in ink, the only ink on a page that's otherwise all pencil, as though she'd wanted this part to be permanent. She wrote something that I didn't find until January. I don't know when she wrote it. It could have been any year, and it's not dated. It says, "A garden is the only honest autobiography. You can lie in words. You can't lie in what you grow. The soil keeps the true draft." I think about Catherine kneeling in plot 34, planting seeds she chose without knowing why. Building a garden that tells the story of a woman she never met. Growing the true draft. I think about what it means that a person's most authentic self-expression can survive the person. Not as a document, not as a memory, not as a digital ghost, but as a tendency in the soil. A pull. A pattern that the ground remembers and offers to the next pair of hands. I think about Lena's question mark. Nasturtiums in the plot. Finally. 2025, it's 2026 now. The question mark has been answered by someone who doesn't know it was a question. And I think, when I'm being the most honest version of myself, on the version that sits on the kitchen floor with Boone and lets the grief be what it is without trying to shape it into something manageable. I think that I am not watching a haunting. I am not watching a replication. I am not watching a miracle or a coincidence or a psychological projection. I am watching my sister finish her garden. And the hardest part, harder than the grief, harder than the silence, harder than the self-discipline it takes not to grab Catherine by the shoulders and say, "Do you know who you are?" The hardest part is that Lena's garden was always a year ahead of Lena. She always planned the next season before the current one was done. The journal always had one more page than the garden had seasons, which means somewhere in Catherine's hands, in the soil's memory, in whatever current connects them, or there is a garden that hasn't been grown yet, a season that Lena imagined but never wrote down, a layout that exists only in the space between a dead woman's intentions and a living woman's instincts. And I will never know if it's right. I will never know if the 2027 garden is what Lena would have grown, because Lena didn't leave a plan for 2027. There's no page to check, no sketch to compare. At some point, this year, next year, the year after, the journal will run out and Catherine's garden will move beyond Lena's documented reach. And I will have no way of knowing whether what I'm watching is still my sister or has become something else. Something that started as Lena and became Catherine. Something that was neither of them and both. And I think that might be the point. I think that might be what Lena meant, without knowing she meant it when she wrote that a garden is an honest autobiography. Autobiographies don't end when the author dies. They end when no one is reading them, and Catherine is reading Lena's autobiography with her hands, in the dirt, one season at a time, without knowing she's reading it all. I'll keep walking. I'll keep watching. I'll keep not telling. The soil keeps the true draft. I'm just the person who knows it's being written.